It's one thing to be a pregnant woman living in the pre-innovative era. It's another thing entirely to be an enslaved pregnant black woman living in that same era. Today, we are going to talk about the hidden horrors endured by pregnant black women who lived in slavery. Pregnant enslaved women were subjected to working long, strenuous hours regardless of the fact that they were with children. There were rarely special treatments given to these women working tirelessly on the plantation. As a matter of fact, enslaved women were forced to resume work within days after giving birth. Women were frequently coerced into non-consensual sexual relationships for the sole purpose of multiplying their owner's slave bands, as well as increasing production on the plantation, wealth, and social status of the slave masters. These abhorrent practices were reinforced by laws that treated slaves as property rather than human beings, dehumanizing these enslaved women to the barest. But it didn't all start like this. During the early transatlantic era, the fertility of black female slaves was completely irrelevant to their owners. The slave masters were very much less concerned about the fertility of their slaves. They focused more on the steady importation of slaves and often viewed each slave as a replaceable commodity. Slave women also expressed slim desires to have children, given that they had little to no control in shaping the future of their children while living in bondage. Planters saw pregnancy and young children as liabilities in female slaves' productivity. The disparity between the number of children belonging to slave women versus European women was so high that the abolitionists used it to demonstrate that slave conditions were in no way fit to sustain human life. However, a lot of these perspectives changed years down the line, when planters discovered that they could actually exploit female fertility in breeding children that would eventually become their slave property. The prohibition of the importation of slaves in 1808 limited the supply of slaves into the United States. During this period, there was a growing demand for slave labor due to the expansion of plantations, resulting in an increase in the internal slave market. In order to keep the business of cash crop production and exportation afloat, slave owners turned into the productivity of the slaves they currently had. A practice Professor Eric Foner referred to as natural increase. Because slave owners viewed offspring as a natural extension of their ownership, reproductive labor quickly became folded into the expectations of slave women. Intimacies like breastfeeding became regulated by masters, and their investment in slave reproduction stripped women of any ounce of autonomy they might have had formerly. In a book titled Slave Narratives, escaped slaves recounted that at least a portion of slave owners continuously interfered in the sexual lives of their slaves, usually the women. Slaves were given hoods or bags over their heads to keep them from knowing who they were having forced sexual relations with, which could have been someone they knew, perhaps a brother, a nephew, or even a father. You will think that when these women eventually fell pregnant, their burdens were reduced. But the reality that existed for pregnant women was that of horror and suffering. The birthing practices that enslaved women were subjected to can be described as often being inhumane and lacking adequate care. Enslaved women were typically denied access to proper health care and medical support during pregnancy and childbirth. They were often subjected to the control and exploitation of their owners, who prioritized their economic interests over the well-being of enslaved women and their babies. These women were often forced to continue working throughout their pregnancies, often performing physically demanding tasks in the fields until they went into labor. This physical hard labor, combined with poor nutrition, lack of parental care, and unsanitary living conditions, put both the mother and the baby at significant risk. Enslaved women were typically attended to by midwives, who were often other enslaved women with limited medical training. These midwives did their best to provide support, but they were working within a system that limited their resources and often prioritized the interests of the slaveholders. As a result, complications during childbirth were common, and mortality rates for both mothers and infants were significantly higher compared to the general population. Enslaved black women were subjected to birthing practices that often exposed them to infections and sometimes permanent injury. Breaking off the pelvis was done to expand the birthing canal during delivery. often used when the canal is too narrow and the child cannot pass through. This procedure caused excruciating pain and often created long-lasting complications that impacted their daily lives. The disregard for their pain and suffering by those who enslaved them further dehumanized these women, denying them the basic rights and dignity they deserved. Due to the substandard practices surrounding care for the pregnant woman and childbirth, a lot of health complications to both mother and child resulted. An estimated 50% of enslaved women's children were either stillborn or died within a year of birth. Harriet Jacobs, former slave and abolitionist, recounted in her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, "There was scarcely a day I was free from chills and fever. My babe also was sickly. His little limbs were often racked with pain. Dr. Flint counted his visits to look after my health, and he did not fail to remind me that my child was an addition to his stock of slaves." White doctors who operated and treated pregnancy-related complications in enslaved women were more interested in protecting the interests of the slave owners, as well as perfecting their own skill set as doctors and physicians, rather than out of concern for the ailing mothers. Vaginal fistulas became a common medical condition experienced by women post-delivery. The painful condition occurs when there's an abnormal connection between the vaginal wall and another organ like the rectum or bladder. These conditions were often painful and manifested as an inability to control urine flow or constant leak of stool. Women suffering from this condition were segregated and shamed by their owners. And because the ill women were not fit enough to perform as much physical labor, their owners constantly looked for patchy solutions to manage their health conditions in order to speedily return them back to work. Dr. J. Marion Sims, an Alabama surgeon, carried out a series of experimental operations on black slave women between 1845 and 1849. A lot of black women were subjected to gruesome experimental procedures without the use of anesthesia or any pain medication. According to Sims, black people could withstand higher amounts of pain, a myth that persists to this day. Sims' initial attempts to fix fistulas were carried out on the enslaved women who he courted in a small hospital behind his home in Montgomery, Alabama. 3 black women, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, stood out among the victims of Sims' horrendous experiments. The 3 women, though working on different plantations, all suffered fistulas. Sims, believing he could cure the women, began carrying out experiments on their bodies in an attempt to find solutions to their conditions. The surgeries were usually painful. The naked woman screamed in pain for hours, restricted to an operating table while other white doctors watched and assisted the entire procedure. Unfortunately for these women, most of Sims' experiments failed, subjecting them to even more pain and complications. However, Sims never relented. It was said that he spent almost 5 years operating on Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and 9 other enslaved women, often repeating the procedure over and over again. Anarcha alone endured at least 30 of these surgeries within the course of the 5 years before he was able to close the holes in her bladder and rectum. Although he inflicted years of agony on enslaved women, Sims is often hailed and regarded as the father of modern gynecology. However, critics sought to bring all the hidden sacrifices by these women to light, expressing that Sims' achievement of fame and fortune was as a result of unethical experimentation with powerless black women, referring to his attempts to cure fistulas as a classic example of the evils of slavery and the misuse of human subjects for medical research. Aurelia Browder, a black activist, stated, "No one talks about these women and their sacrifices and the experimentation they suffered. If you are going to tell the truth about this story, we need to tell it all." Even when women gave birth to children without developing complications, they did not still have it the easy way. Enslaved mothers were often forcibly separated from their newborns shortly after giving birth, sometimes within hours or days. At most, after weaning. This separation was incredibly distressing for both the mothers and their babies, who were abruptly torn apart without any consideration for their emotional well-being or the bond they had formed. The children were taken away and sold off, They were often raised in impoverished environments, which were usually characterized by poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, and inexperienced caregivers. Enslaved mothers would grieve the loss of their children, unsure of how their babies were faring or if they were even still alive. Most of us are aware that slave owners often bred their slaves to produce more workers. We are taught almost nothing about the breeding farms, whose function was to produce as many slaves as possible for sale and distribution through the South to meet production needs. Two of the largest breeding farms were located in Richmond, Virginia, and the Maryland Eastern Shore. The former U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, is regarded as one of the founding fathers of America and is said to have contributed tremendously to modern-day America. However, concerning the affairs of slavery during that time, there were lots of controversies that came up with his name. Although he declared in 1788, nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery. His paradoxical living spoke otherwise. Jefferson owned 607 slaves in his lifetime and owned the biggest slave farms in Virginia. He profited not only from the tobacco, wheat, and corn that his slaves grew in the crop fields, but also from their bodies, particularly their natural increase. In these slave farms, women were subjected to rape, arranged marriages, forced matings, sexual violations, and other forms of sexual abuse for the purpose of sustainable slavery and wealth multiplication. Women became aware that enslavers relied on and prized their ability to reproduce in order to grow the slave population. With this knowledge, they began engaging in acts of resistance related to the agenda of natural increase propagated by slave masters. Some women rebelled against slavery by trying to limit their involvement in the birth of additional enslaved children. Women avoided sexual activities by any means they could, while also employing their inherited knowledge of plants and medicines in preventing pregnancies and even inducing their own miscarriages. New moms ran the risk of eventually losing their children, and if they had girls, they were aware that any sexual abuse they had suffered may also affect their daughters. With this, enslaved women were constantly fighting against the authority slave owners had over their bodies and shielding any future children from the horrors of bondage. At the extreme end of the spectrum of enslaved women's day-to-day resistance lay infanticide. They believed it was more assuring to take the life of their own children than bring them into a world of slavery. The most famous example of infanticide was the case of Margaret Garner, who took the life of her own daughter when caught trying to flee bondage with her children. A common practice amongst women working on plantations was chewing cotton roots to avoid or terminate a pregnancy. Therefore, many slave owners banned women from owning cotton roots, and when they caught enslaved women chewing or storing cotton roots, they punished them with harsh beatings. In all of these, recognizing the horrors experienced by enslaved pregnant women are of utmost importance for several reasons. Firstly, it is a matter of historical truth and accuracy. By acknowledging and documenting these atrocities, we can ensure that the voices and experiences of these women are not erased, forgotten, or silenced. It is essential to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past in order to understand the full scope and impact of slavery on individuals, as well as the entire Black community.